The Tigers are starting their offseason, and they have a few interesting decisions they could make. A team that finished just 9 games back of first in a very weak division, and 11 games out of a wildcard spot, could break their almost 10-year playoff drought. With Eduardo Rodriguez opting out of his contract and Javier Baez opting in, some of the biggest questions of the offseason have already been answered. The Tigers also exercised their team option on backup catcher Carson Kelly. This makes it a lot less likely Dylan Dingler will make the opening day roster, but he can still compete for that backup catcher spot if he plays well in camp. We know Carson Kelly is a solid defensive catcher, and if his bat can improve back to when he was hitting 18 home runs, then I'm sure we will all be glad to see him in the lineup. But if he continues to bat sub 200, then this decision might not look so good. Mark Canha was also acquired by Detroit. This most likely means that Akil Baddoo is going back to the minors or possibly won't even be a member of the Tigers organization anymore. Unless of course he has another amazing spring training and returns to form. But if that doesn't happen, Canha is a solid bat to have. Even as he reaches his late 30s, Mark is on a 5-season streak with a .350 or better on-base percentage. That, along with his bat having a bit of power, will make Canha a solid addition to the Tigers roster. Casey Mize will also be back this season, and while we shouldn't expect him to pick up where he left off immediately, he will still be a solid, if not good, arm to have. And personally, I just miss watching Casey Mize pitch. If Skubal and Manning can stay healthy, with another solid starter being added, the Tigers could have a good rotation next year. Along with that, Spencer Torkelson, Matt Vierling, Zach McKinstry, Kerry Carpenter, Riley Green, Jake Rogers, and maybe even Andy Ibanez were all pretty nice bats last year and are returning this year. If Green can stay healthy and Torkelson can avoid a slow start, those two might be all-star level players next year. Colt Keith and Justin Henry Malloy both could make this year's team. I believe Malloy might even be able to have a fairly immediate impact. His bat mixed with his defensive versatility could help him find his way into the opening day lineup. Keith is probably less likely to make it this year, but he still does have a shot. Honestly, this Tigers team doesn't necessarily need to make some big free agent acquisition to make this team a possible playoff contender. Really, they need to find a replacement for Eduardo Rodriguez, or bring Eduardo back. I doubt they get a guy like Blake Snell, but if they can add a solid arm to this rotation and keep the bullpen strong, the Tigers will be in good shape. First off, I would like to see us sign maybe Jack Flaherty to add to the starting rotation. I know he had a rough year last year, but he is a guy that the Tigers could gamble on. Shouldn't be crazy expensive, and while he could continue to regress, he could also return to form. At 28 years old, it is entirely possible that he ends up still being a solid pitcher in the rotation. They could bring back Michael Lorenzen, but that's probably just wishful thinking on my part. While he wasn't exactly worthy of an all-star selection, he's still a really nice pitcher to have and a fun personality to have in the clubhouse. Now, if the Tigers want to spend a little more money and take a risk, they could sign Lucas Giolito. But Jordan Montgomery might be the most realistic name I've brought up so far. He's a pretty consistent sub-4 ERA starter, and the biggest challenge is convincing him to come to Detroit. Going from a World Series champion to a team that is trying to fight for a low seed in the playoffs probably isn't ideal to him. But if they can pull it off, he would be a fantastic signing for the Detroit Tigers. And there are plenty of bullpen arms out there for Scott Harris to acquire. So the Tigers have options to help the pitching staff. Obviously, there are lots of iffy factors and question marks on this team. But what would the Tigers' starting lineup most likely look like without any injuries? Well, we know first base is locked up by Spencer Torkelson. He had a 30 home run and almost 100 RBI season. And along with that, I know his fielding metrics don't look the best, but if you've watched him play first, you know he can pick balls out of the dirt pretty well and can make some impressive plays in general at first. Second base will most likely be Zach McKinstry. While his bat is very average, he was a Gold Glove finalist. Granted, he was a utility man finalist and not a second baseman finalist, but Gold Glove consideration still shows how skilled he is. Now, because Zach is a utility man, they could sign someone who is a better hitter. But the pickings are really slim. Realistically, Tony Kemp or Adam Frazier would be the best options. And I just don't suggest splurging money on a guy who would only be a slight step up. McKinstry has earned his spot. Let's see what he can do in year 2 with Detroit. His bat might even improve. Shortstop is another obvious one, as Javier Baez doesn't necessarily play up to the role of star middle infielder. But since he just opted into a huge second half of his contract, we might as well play him. Who knows, maybe he can somewhat return to form. Third base is a very interesting spot, as you have Matt Vierling who can play there, but he is mainly an outfielder at this point. And Ibanez could also play there. So it is entirely possible that those two split time at third. As I've said before, Vierling and Ibanez both played well on offense. I honestly admire those two a lot because I don't think people really saw them producing the way they did last year. They both had career best years, but an intriguing option is calling up Justin Henry Malloy. Malloy is another personal favorite of mine, and if he plays well enough in spring training, I think Detroit should definitely call him up to the majors. He would probably spend most of his time at third, so if he makes the opening day roster, I would expect him to be there. Catcher is Jake Rogers most likely. Center field is Riley Green. Riley can really do it all as long as he stays healthy, so hopefully nothing crazy happens this year and we can see him play 120 or more games. Left field is probably Mark Canha. After trading for him, I think it's obvious the Tigers will want the guy to be a prominent player this upcoming year. And then right could be Vierling if Malloy is at third, or it could be Carpenter unless Carpenter is DHing. So for the sake of this, I'm going to say that Justin Henry Malloy is at third base and Kerry Carpenter is DHing, so he can do what he does best, making Matt Vierling our starting right fielder. Opening day pitcher will most likely be Skubal unless Mize is healthy or if we sign Blake Snell or Sonny Gray. Honestly, my dream rotation is Sonny Gray, Casey Mize, Terry Skubal, Matt Manning, and the fifth man would probably be Reese Olson, because he showed some promise last year with a 3.99 ERA across 18 starts. Alex Lang is our closer too. I mean, he had a pretty solid year last year. And our bench is probably looking like Andy Ibanez, Carson Kelly, Parker Meadows, as long as he continues to improve, and maybe Akil Baddoo. Now this could change, and I'm making some judgment decisions based on what I think the Tigers will do, but this is the best I got. And if you're noticing that I didn't really mention Austin Meadows, it's because he's probably not going to be on the team next year. So you might be asking if this is a playoff team. Maybe. If these guys all play at least to expectations or hopefully above that, and Javier Baez returns to at least decent shape, and our roster doesn't get wrecked with injuries, then this team can compete for a spot in a very weak division. Honestly, what I'm expecting of this team is fun. A young, hungry group of guys that play above 500 baseball and are still in the hunt during September. Entertaining baseball in a city that hasn't had much of that. And if the Tigers play entertaining baseball, it could lead to a playoff appearance. But I'm not going to make a crazy statement claiming we will 100% make the playoffs. However, I do think this team will be really fun to watch, especially with all these young players coming into their own, or in the case of Malloy, making their debut. So yeah, this Tigers year hopefully will be really fun. It won't be kind of depressing and disappointing like how the last few years have been. But I think there's a good shot that we get at least entertaining baseball, not necessarily playoffs, but something that you won't dread watching. Anyways, I'm Limitless Pulls. Thank you for watching this far into the video. I'll see you guys next week.
Never ever will I fold, even if my clothes wrinkled. Bitch ain't single, but this kid'll make a whole me. You don't make the roster if that throw go make my toes.